We are talking today with Norm Stamper. He is the former Seattle police chief and author of the new book, Breaking Ranks, A Top Cop's Expose on the Dark Side of American Policing. Let me start and ask you, what was your motivation in writing your book, Breaking Rank?
I had two motives. One was to share with readers my particular take on a variety of issues that I think are critical to public safety and to civil liberties and social justice in this country. And that's kind of the polemical side of the book. I also was interested in exploring for my benefit as well as readers' benefit why I became a cop, how in such a very short period of time I turned from a reasonably idealistic 21-year-old into a police officer who frequently violated the civil liberties and abused the citizens that he was hired to serve. And once I got my comeuppance and slapped down by a principal prosecutor, and a number of other factors came to bear to put me back on what I consider to be the right track, what it was like to spend almost all of my career as a change agent, attempting to alter the structure and the culture of American policing.
You start out your book with a letter to David Bram, the former Tacoma police chief. Why did you start there? Is that critical to kind of understanding how police become what they are?
David Bram presented us tragically with a very high-profile domestic violence case. This city, Seattle, records anywhere from 13,000 to 15,000 domestic violence calls a year. I personally believe that violence in the home and violence between and among intimate others is a precursor to all other forms of violence. I think that violence taught in the home has a way of manifesting in the school, in the workplace. I believe it has national and international implications. So for me, the top priority for law enforcement needs to be the prevention of violence in the home and violence between significant others. And that certainly does include child abuse as well.
A lot of the points you hit on in your book seem fairly radical in terms of American or U.S. police forces. And I'm wondering if we can talk about a bunch of those, but maybe kind of separating them into things of national, that is defined by national policy versus those that are defined on a local level. And several of those on what I would define under a national policy would be drug decriminalization and prostitution. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, I sure can. I, as I write in my book, I believe by any standard or any reasonable definition, we have lost the so-called war on drugs. It was, to my way of thinking, a bankrupt mission to begin with. We've been at it now for decades. We're not seeing any lessening of the demand for drugs. We do all sorts of things, some of them quite draconian and international in scope, to try to limit the supply of drugs. And our efforts to enforce those laws, I think, have led to a wide variety of really unfortunate consequences. The extravagant expense associated with fighting the drug war, the very nature of the commodities being traded, given that they are defined as illicit, makes them attractive not only to 13 and 14-year-old kids who might be pushing drugs on the streets, but also to the, shall we call them, character-challenged police officers who run across a lot of drugs in the course of their work. Almost all of the biggest scandals in the last 10, 15 years in policing have been traceable to drugs. But I think the fundamental problem is that drugs ought not to be a banned substance. If we can tolerate alcohol, which is clearly the most damaging of all drugs in our society, or for that matter, nicotine, it seems to me that we can and should view the use of other substances as lawful for adults. I'm not suggesting legalization as such. I am suggesting decriminalization, which would keep the government involved in a regulatory capacity, much as the government is involved today with cigarettes and other forms of tobacco and alcohol. So I'm just convinced that we can do a lot to improve public safety and the health of our communities by withdrawing from the drug war and treating drug use as a right of Americans who, in their behavior, do not abuse that drug in such a way that it causes damage to community or to others. And treating drug abuse as a medical problem and a public health problem, because clearly that's what it is. I find it unconscionable that we have waiting lists in many cities for methadone treatment, that many cities refuse to allow needle exchanges or to sell clean syringes in pharmacies, for example. People are going to use drugs, pure and simple. They're going to use drugs. If they're going to use drugs and we're willing to at least have an honest conversation about it, we can find a much better way to make families, individuals, communities safer.
All right. And how about prostitution? You see a similar situation there?
I do see it as similar. Prostitution has been around for as long as we've been around as a species. I'm torn on this issue because I personally believe that the sex industry can, in fact, lure people to it, usually on the promise of a decent salary or maybe even a lucrative income. But it can, in fact, attract people who really are making a bad decision by entering that field. There are many, I think of Coyote and other organizations, who maintain that women have as much of a choice to make as far as how they want to spend themselves in their work, whether it's in an office or on the streets or in a hotel room, whatever they choose to do. The civil libertarian side of me says that's certainly true. I think there are many sort of secondary and tertiary problems that are associated with prostitution trafficking as it's practiced today. So my position would be, let's take it off the streets. Street prostitution is extremely dangerous, as well as often unhealthy in terms of contracting diseases and the like. Canada has recently moved to bar street prostitution, but to permit what is essentially indoor prostitution, operating out of a home or an apartment or a hotel room or a motel room, that sort of thing. In the end, on that particular issue, I came down on the side of safety for sex industry workers. We need only to look to Gary Ridgway and the most prolific serial killing string in the history of this country to realize how much at risk women on the streets are in engaging in street prostitution. Other countries around the world have done the same, have basically moved it indoors, which is not to say that it makes it completely safe, but it does strengthen pretty dramatically the position of safety for women in the sex industry, and for men, as a matter of fact, as well.
And my understanding is Canada as well, using that as an example, is also a little more progressive with dealing with drugs. They are.
One of the dreams that I have for this book is that it will provoke, I don't want to say like-minded. There are very few people in the business, I think, who have my political orientation, which is clearly leftist and progressive. But there are some chiefs who really do see the systemic implications of the drug war, and they recognize that it's unwinnable, and they realize that they're essentially tossing money down the drain and they're not helping people in the community. Which is not to say that there aren't arrests that do, in fact, provide a measure of comfort to a neighborhood that's been plagued by, let's say, violent drug dealing or violent gang activity associated with drug dealing and so forth. I don't in any way want to minimize that. But these are police executives who, if they were to speak up, if they were to at least raise the question about how much money, time, interest, imagination, equipment, people we are spending or investing in this war on drugs that could be spent elsewhere to much greater effect in terms of public safety, that we could do the kinds of things they're doing in Canada. It was the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police who, in fact, wrote a position paper on the legalization of marijuana. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police soon after joined in an expression of support for their local police chiefs throughout Canada. And in the Netherlands, for example, we have, before I left my job as police chief in Seattle, I had a visit from a contingent from The Hague. And in the Netherlands, this was a contingent, incidentally, of police chiefs, high-ranking officials, judges, and prosecutors, about a dozen of them. And we had a really wonderful, very rich talk about how that country is moving to deal with its drug problems. They still go after organized drug dealers, and I applaud that. But they treat drug users in a fundamentally different way. Those who are experiencing problems with drugs, who can't or won't behave responsibly under their influence, get held to account for their behavior, but it is essentially decriminalized and treated as a health problem.
As well as your views on capital punishment and gun control seem to go against the norm here in the United States. Can you talk about that?
Well, they sure do, although I would argue that taking the latter subject first, which is a very hot topic and one that invariably results in spirited debates every time I express my opinion in the traditional circles that I've in which I've operated. But I am absolutely convinced, both from a personal experience as well as a research point of view, that the easy access that so many Americans have to firearms is directly responsible for violence in the home, on the streets, in our schools, in the workplace, and that we can, if we'll just you excuse the expression, bite the bullet and get smart about reasonable gun controls. And I refer particularly to handguns, although rifles and certainly semi-automatic rifles and Uzis and other forms of high-powered, rapidly firing firearms have created untold damage in our communities. Most of the problem does come from handguns. And I believe that every one of them should be registered and every owner should be licensed, contingent upon his or her successful passing of a gun safety course of instruction, and that every firearm, every pistol needs to be locked up and secured in the home. We could prevent many of the thousands upon thousands of suicides that result from firearm wounds. We can get guns out of kids' hands. We can dramatically reduce the violence and the tragedy that's associated with gun violence in this society.
Clarify that for me. How would a gun lock prevent someone who's going to commit suicide with their handgun?
It wouldn't. What I'm suggesting is that if it's their handgun, it's their lockbox, and they are so inclined, there's not a lot that one can do, short of a plea for intervention, to help that person make the right choice, in my opinion, which would be not to do oneself in. But one of the things that we know is that readily accessible handguns, and by putting them in a box and locking them up and having to work a combination to get back into them and so forth, still makes them accessible, but not readily accessible. And a lot of suicides are not so much, well, many of them are in fact spur of the moment, but they've been part of a contemplative process up until that point at which somebody reaches for a weapon of choice. If they reach for pills, there's a good chance that we can save them. If they reach for a razor blade, we still may have a shot at saving them. If they reach for the gun, the chances are slim that they in fact will survive that, particularly if they know what they're doing with it. But how many instances, just in my time in Seattle, how many instances have we seen in which children have picked up a gun in the home, taken it to Garfield High School or out on the street and done some damage with it? I have a personal stake in the gun control issue. I shot and killed a man because I thought he was armed and because he was threatening to kill his son. I wept for a fellow police officer in San Diego whose 5-year-old son took daddy's gun out from under daddy's pillow and shot himself with it, killed himself. Accidentally, of course. There are just too many tragedies associated with firearms. I understand and I respect the membership of the NRA and the reasons they want guns, whether it's for personal protection or target shooting, competitions, or simply because they're collectors. I get that. I really do. But I think the time has come for us to get real serious about responsible handgun controls. And it's not a subject that we hear nearly enough about because I think people are afraid to talk about it. The NRA is awesomely powerful as a lobbyist. But Americans historically, for certainly up to 9/11, were coming down in the 60 to 70% range of support for these reasonable kinds of controls. 9/11 saw a bit of a spike. There's evidence that that's now beginning to taper off a little bit, and we're coming, in my opinion, back to our senses about how to make guns, those that are going to remain in this society, a little safer. The other issue of capital punishment that you I think accurately describe as a national issue, although states have the right. Washington has the right to outlaw the death penalty. Michigan's abolition of the death penalty dates back to the middle, basically, of the 19th century. And there are many states, at least a dozen, that have in fact abolished the death penalty, which would put those states in league with the entire European Union and many, many other countries around the world. As a country, most of our states still embrace the death penalty. None using the death penalty more prolifically than the state of Texas, particularly under George Bush. And my problem with the death penalty is multifaceted. At the top of my list is my belief that it's a cowardly thing to do. Once I draw an analogy that would certainly cause some of my fellow officers to choke on it. But if you've handcuffed a prisoner, the threat's over, basically. It can still kick you, but you've got control. If you beat a handcuffed prisoner, that's tantamount, to my way of thinking, to the spirit behind capital punishment. Once somebody is incarcerated in a true maximum security facility, they're not going to kill anymore on the streets. Is it possible that they could kill behind the walls of an institution? Yes. That happens much more rarely, I think, than people think. So a maximum security prison is a secure facility. And it seems to me that no matter how heinous the crime, the logical and moral course is to, in fact, incarcerate them for life without possibility of parole. As I acknowledge in the book, I admit to moments when I say this person's different, this person needs to be taken out and killed for what he or she has done. And there are fleeting moments when I have that strong, visceral reaction. And when I have them, I remind myself of several things. One of them is that racism in the criminal justice system, and certainly as it applies to criminal trials and prosecutions, criminal trials, and sentencing to maximum security facilities or to death row, is tied not only to race, really, but to class as well, and that there are many people who simply cannot afford a dream team to defend them against a murder charge. With indigent defendants, you are looking at appointed counsel. It's uneven, to say the least, across this country. And I have no doubt that innocent people have been put to death in this country. People who did not commit the crime have been killed by the state. So those, to me, are very good reasons not to embrace the death penalty as enthusiastically as many in our country do. And I guess I would also add that I think it lessens us as a people when the state takes a life. It's just real easy, I think, to develop the rabid feelings in support of the death penalty, and then to be conveniently distanced from the actual execution of the death penalty. And I think it does lessen us as a society. Puts us in league with Iraq, Iran, North Korea. Those are the states that also continue to use the death penalty as their ultimate punishment.
If we could shift over towards a local jurisdiction, and let's use Seattle as our example, and talk about things that community can have impact on with its local police force. Sure. And one of the things we're wrestling with here in Seattle is citizen oversight of SPD. And there's been a lot of back and forth on that. We currently have an OPA that, from a citizen standpoint, I think a lot of people feel is ineffective. So I want to get your take on citizen oversight and what you see as both optimal and realistic in those terms.
I'll begin by saying that I think oftentimes citizens do not have an appreciation of the conscientiousness and the talent and the skills of internal investigators and police administrations to actually ferret out police misconduct and to deal with it. And I took it as a source of pride that we went from something like 4% sustained rate on citizen complaints up to almost a quarter of those complaints, which I think is a very credible level. You still evaluate each investigation case by case by case, but when you're sustaining 4% of them, there's a pretty good indication, to my way of thinking, that you're not doing a very good job. And it could, in fact, be a case of the police being unable to police themselves, to look another officer in the eye and ask the kinds of questions that need to be asked and to draw the kinds of conclusions that the facts lead you to. But we made some good progress, and I just wanted to begin, I guess, by saying that there are an awful lot of good people working internal affairs. They don't get a lot of credit from their fellow officers often. But I do believe that politically, and I guess from the perspective of perception, as well as the reality in many jurisdictions, the police cannot police themselves, and that they need, in fact, to be overseen by responsible civilian entities, agencies, organizations, groups, however they're structured. And there are many different ways to, as you're, I'm sure, well aware, to design community oversight. I believe that community oversight, if it's to be credible, has to have investigative powers. I believe that it has to have subpoena powers. I believe that it has not only a right but an obligation to adjudicate, to make a decision about whether allegation A is in fact sustained, or it's unfounded, or yes, the actions described did take place, but we are exonerating the officer because that was the right thing for the officer to do under the circumstances. Only in those cases where there is a not sustained finding, which basically means more often than not a he said, she said, he said situation, those civilian review groups should in fact have the investigative power and be called upon to make the decision. I draw the line at discipline. I do not believe that citizen groups should administer discipline, they certainly should not administer discipline, nor should they, in my view, make a determination of what the discipline should be. I think that is the chief's responsibility. If it's taken from the chief, it becomes, it could easily become one of those "it's not my job" habits of police administrators. Well, you've taken it out of my hands. What can I do? A police chief needs to have disciplinary authority over his or her police department and the actions of the officers. If the citizens group is not happy with the discipline, the administration of discipline, it's got an enormously powerful bully pulpit from which to express that concern. It can also, in certain cities, certain jurisdictions, on disciplinary findings in cases where, for example, a citizens review board doesn't have the right to definitively draw a conclusion about what happened, they can appeal that. They can appeal it to the, in our jurisdiction, it would be the county prosecutor. They can appeal it to the feds. There are any number of different appeal mechanisms that could be created if the citizens group is unhappy with the choice of a chief, for example, to refuse those the investigative findings. I hope I'm not making this too confused, but it is important to me to draw a distinction between investigation and adjudication on the one hand, and the administration of discipline on the other.
And how, again, using Seattle as an example, it seems that one of the hurdles is that the Seattle Police Department is structured under the guild, which is certainly not transparent to the public. I don't know if it's transparent to anyone else. And then on our side, the citizen side, there is Seattle City Council goes to bat in the negotiations every 3 years, I think it is. How do citizens weigh in on that when you've got, a body like a guild that even to other labor groups doesn't appear particularly transparent?
Well, my chapter on police unions is entitled "Up with Labor," and parenthetically, "Not so fast police unions." I think the advent of police unions has been one of the most important developments, social and political developments of the early 20th century, when police officers worked under horrible, horrible conditions for virtually no money. And there are all kinds of problems associated with the history of policing and the organization, the design of policing to begin with. But the cops were not treated well. And one consequence of that is who wants that kind of a job? And if people don't want that kind of a job, who are you going to hire? You're going to hire some people that are probably going to do more damage to the community than they are to, than they're going to be able to prevent damage to the community. So I have no qualms with that. In fact, strongly support those unions that have fought arbitrary and capricious administrative decisions and neglect on the part of the citizenry to provide them the hours, wages, terms, and conditions of employment that unions generally form themselves to advance. But something went wrong along the line, and police unions grew very strong in many jurisdictions throughout the country, and many politicians grew frightened of them or enamored of them. So either to keep themselves from earning the wrath of a police union or to tag along and get the support that the union as an entity can possess from one community to another, they have not confronted the issues that, to my way of thinking, create the biggest strains in police administration and police guilds and unions in jurisdictions across the country. Police officers have campaigned for and won, for reasons that I understand, an extra set of due process rights. For the longest time, Seattle police officers did not have to submit to questioning from an internal investigator. All they had to do was file a report. In Delaware, I believe it is, I cite this in the book, a police officer accused of a very serious act of misconduct, which might have criminal implications, doesn't have to give a statement for a week. We don't do those things with criminal defendants that we arrest. And it seems to me that if we're going to achieve accountability in policing, we have got to look to the relationship between, as you pointed out, city council, the mayor, the police chief, and the citizens in general, and that police union. And while I would not argue for gutting the power of police unions, I would in fact argue for citizens to become aroused and organized and mobilized to look at how police unions thwart civilian oversight, equal employment opportunity, promotional practices, and other measures of accountability that are designed to enhance the reputation of the police department. And too often the union's on the other side.
It seems sometimes that it's a toss-up as to who really has more influence over the local police in any given city, the police chief or the union. And I'd actually, from my observations, I'd have to lean more towards the police guild. Seems to have more oversight and more influence anyway with the police.
Well, a lot of citizens take that view as well. And of course, I would refute it as it relates to my 6 years in office. I was the police chief. I knew and understood what my authority was. And I exercised it to the fullest extent that I was capable under the laws and the policies and the contracts that had been negotiated between the city and the Police Officers Guild. My problem with the Guild is not so much its sanctioned right to represent as the bargaining agent, the collective that is the police officers of the city of Seattle. My problem is in the way individuals in leadership roles in the guild over the years, and there have been some really fine guild presidents. There have been some other guild presidents who, in my opinion, were not interested in working together to achieve, the kinds of accountability measures and fairness in employment practices and so forth that we were all interested in. I think the Guild's sort of knee-jerk reaction to many issues was that the administration was out to get them, and the administration was out to undermine their authority as the bargaining agent, and even the finest of technical points would wind up being argued ad nauseum, when in fact, reasonable minds can get together and say, we want a safe city, we want a good police department with an exceptional safety record and high morale. We want a department whose members subscribe to and practice the highest standards of professional conduct. Where do we differ on this? But I think there is tension built into the system, principally through the contract, that makes it very difficult to do that. How could the police guild thwart civilian oversight for as long as it did before it came on board with, as you point out, a model that's still limited? I identify Seattle's model as, of all the civilian review programs in the country, as one of the weaker models in the United States, and trace that directly to the police guild. So I guess maybe in that long explanation, I came around to saying, you got a point. They do have a lot of power.
Well, talk about the militarization of our police forces, because I think once the WTO in 1999 hit, I think that really drilled it home to a lot of people just how much things were getting militarized. Well,
clearly during a cataclysmic event of the scope and the nature of WTO, you're going to have police officers on the streets who look very military, if not sci-fi-ish. And I, before I go any further, will say that I would never support putting police officers on the front lines of any situation in which rocks and bottles and chunks of concrete and other missiles are being directed their way in what's called soft uniforms. I believe that they do need to be geared up. Is it a menacing sight? Well, it depends on, it's menace, I guess, is in the eye of the beholder. I see it as safety gear for police officers. But I also do believe very strongly that we have over the years done some things in the interests of building police-community relationships that have helped to demilitarize aspects of policing, but not nearly enough. We've embraced community policing. We've done a lot of work in forging partnerships, and some of that actually does go beyond rhetoric in many cities throughout the country. In other cities, it is purely rhetoric, and it's just it's window dressing. But I really do believe that as long as we function as a paramilitary bureaucracy in American cities, we will be seen as distant, either oppressive or threatening or intimidating, or perhaps even neglectful as we move in our internal bureaucratic circles and keep our citizens from participating in the activities of the department. If you want a true community-oriented police department, citizens have got to be a part of that police department in very meaningful ways. Not just civilian oversight, but civilian advice and civilian participation in program development and policy making. I think citizens should be involved in virtually every aspect of police work. In fact, I can't think of an area or an arena in which citizens should not be invited in by a police department. Short of the invitation, citizens need to take responsibility for police departments that are cold or aloof or distant or so militaristic that you don't know what's going on behind that figurative face shield on the helmeted police officer. The way that gets accomplished, it seems to me, is for citizens to exercise their rights as Americans and say, you belong to us, not the other way around. The police in America belong to the public they serve. If this is a radical statement, so be it. The police in America are, by definition, the people's police. Is that the practice? Or is it merely some, abstract theory? And my contention is it's not the practice. Police departments basically own their own policies, their own procedures. They're in too many instances sealed off from the very communities that they've been created to serve. And if the vocabulary of the police department is arcane, it's mysterious, it's militaristic, change it. I tried that once in San Diego. It wasn't wildly successful. I recommended that we demilitarize the titles of sergeants, lieutenants, and captains, which were the three ranks that bore distinctly military titles, and made that recommendation public. I was the assistant chief at the time, and the super chief, Bob Bergreen by name, said, well, I said, I know you're going to kill this recommendation, but I want to put it out there and let's see how the organization responds to it. And if one of our problems was internal communication, we solved that problem very quickly when I made that recommendation. I got hate mail, I got phone calls, I got letters from around the country. I got an editorial from the San Diego Union Tribune saying that to deep six nomenclature and get back to the basics of sergeants, lieutenants, and captains. My purpose in making that recommendation was to spur a dialogue. I knew it wouldn't fly. I believe in it, however. I'll say that. I do believe in it, but I knew it wouldn't fly. What I wanted was the opportunity to talk about what is distinctively different between a cop and a soldier. And a police officer, well, start with a soldier. The soldier follows orders for a living. And, regardless of political perspective, most people will accept that you have to, if you're a soldier, follow orders for a living, unless they're illegal. Police officers make decisions for a living all day, every day. That's what they do. They don't have sergeants breathing down their necks. They are not being directed to do this, do that. They make enormously powerful, discretionary decisions for a living. Life and death decisions, peace and freedom decisions, the decision to stop a car or not to stop a car, the decision to write a ticket or not write a ticket, the decision to pull one's gun or not, the decision to pull the trigger or not. Nobody can make that decision for the police officer because he or she is out there essentially alone in the moment, performing one of society's most critical tasks. And to the extent that we're willing to do it, we need to imbue in those police officers a sense of responsibility and power, sufficient power to allow them to use their creativity and their imagination and to work with the community to solve problems. But if they're seen as distant, aloof, in control of the policies and procedures of the department rather than sharing those policies and procedures with the citizens, we'll continue to have that major gap and all these tensions in community police relations.
So what do you see as some specific recommendations, again, for here in Seattle so that citizens can work together with police towards reform, what I'll call reforming the police departments, especially when you're looking at the bulk of the citizens who are most energetic about making changes are perceived by the police department as being extremists and the people that they would probably least like to work with?
Well, it's hard for me to answer that question without pontificating a little bit. I think those who are cast as extremists are as often as not being castigated or ignored because of the manner in which they present their case. To draw an analogy, during WTO, during the battle in Seattle, tens of thousands of nonviolent demonstrators wanted to talk about globalization and the economic, political, moral ills associated with that, by definition, global movement. A handful, relatively, of other protesters elected other means to express themselves. I think the battle in Seattle was a boon to the anti-globalization conversation because it surely took something that for a lot of folks was kind of obscure, myself included, prior to November of 1999 and made it international news. I wish it had happened some other way, but that's life. But the ones who were throwing newsstands through windows and chucking concrete at police officers or spiking their tires and letting the air out of them and things like that, and pulling police officer off his horse and so forth, I think really did muck it up for everybody else. And I would like to have had an opportunity for all of our citizens to have what Paul Schell was calling this dialogue on the streets and in the coffee houses and restaurants of Seattle. So I use that by way of analogy. For those who advocate civilian oversight, who would like to see more work done on police use of lethal force or on the use of tasers or other issues that are sensitive and controversial, my advice would be behave responsibly, organize, mobilize, don't get caught up in name-calling and demonizing your police officers, your police chief, your mayor, your council. I think it's real important to show up at council meetings. I think it's real important to write letters, to petition. Very important, as long as it's not used so much that folks begin to draw away from it, to organize demonstrations and to let elected officials and your police agency know what you think about police practices. And so my advice would be, if it's to the extent that it's possible, that collection of critics needs to come together. And that usually means forging coalitions, because there are going to be differences between and among people who've got heartache or heartburn over police practices. Find out what your common ground is, find out what you can agree upon, and then press the case. And too often I see distractions and divergence of opinion and so forth as kind of deal killers. We can't talk to each other. We can't get along. But I think responsible police practices in a city really does demand that.
Do you currently see that there are mechanisms available for more dialogue between interested citizens and the actual police in a given area, in this case, let's say Seattle? Because again, it seems like there isn't a lot of venues, with the exception of maybe a few officers that they put forward for speaking engagements, for people to actually, dialogue so that both sides can actually listen to the other side.
I had a total, by the time I left, a total of 10 community advisory councils with whom I met personally, regularly. Officers were encouraged to attend. We didn't handpick, showcase officers who looked like recruitment posters and so forth. We got the beat cops who worked the area. I invited the police guild to participate because I thought it was important for them to hear directly from the citizens, not a chief they've heard from many, many times, but citizens saying, what's up with this? Why are you guys fighting this? And have some kind of a dialogue that might produce some common understanding and maybe some movement in a right direction. And they wouldn't show. They just refused to come. So they never did participate in the African American Community Advisory Council, for example, or any other that during my watch. So that's one mechanism. I don't know what's happened to that. I understand that many of those community advisory councils are still around, whether it's in name or there's substance to it, I don't know. But I really do believe, sort of in keeping with what you asked, that it's got to be a dialogue between the officers in that neighborhood, in that community, and the citizens that they serve with to achieve public safety and address problems of civil liberties and social justice. That kind of conversation held regularly produces some pretty incredible insights on the part of both sides of the equation. And I've had many, many citizens tell me, thank you for the Citizens Academy that you formed. We did it's more than a snapshot of the actual police academy and presented that over a 12-week period to citizens. And the original criteria for both the Citizens Academy and my community advisory councils is we don't want to stack this with the pro-police forces, the ones who've got the scanners and are police groupies or just can't get enough of things police. We wanted citizens who had difficulty with police officers or difficulty with police practices. And some pretty remarkable conversations were started and carried out over a period of time that left both my police officers and the citizens saying that they had their eyes opened. It's just so encouraging to hear it on both sides, and it's doable. It can happen.
Sticking for another second with the militarization of police, do you see a problem with the number of new police that are brought into police forces that are coming directly from the military? It seems like there's somewhat of a bias based on the economics of getting new police officers, that you can pick up guys or women from the military pretty easily without, with less training than you would from regular citizens coming in off the street.
Well, regardless of the amount of training that either a non-military or military candidate has had, every police recruit is going to go through the same training. So there is that. And I think there is an inclination on the part of many police recruiters and perhaps police administrations to go with ex-military. The rationale being more discipline, more maturity. They've been around. They've certainly, given what's going on in the world today, seen much more than the average 21, 22-year-old recruit. And it's an understandable bias, but it's got problems when it becomes a policy, a practice, to specifically target military with the idea that they've got an edge over a non-military candidate. And I say that because I believe, especially in light of the war in Iraq, actually let's go all the way back to the first Gulf War, or we could go back to the Vietnam War. People coming out of a wartime experience have have experienced something perhaps you and I don't know your background, but I was not in the military, have never experienced. And some people can handle that experience well and others cannot. And we have seen upon return to the United States some pretty horrific crimes committed by soldiers who couldn't seem to turn off the killing instinct, if you will. Fort Bragg particularly got a lot of publicity as a result of several spousal assaults that resulted in murder. And it was a kind of a spate of them within a pretty short period of time. If nothing else, that really ought to trigger some intense soul-searching and a very careful examination of your hiring and screening policies and procedures. The last thing I would do is reject somebody because of military experience. The last thing I would do is automatically take somebody because of military experience. So what it comes down to is a rigorous testing process, very careful psychological screening, and an honest, conscientious effort to find out as much as you can about a candidate before you ever pin the badge on them.
All right. I have to ask you about a specific aspect of the WTO.
Sure.
I spent in fact, I spent that whole week pretty much in the streets with other people and talked to a lot of people, videotaped a lot of stuff. There was a sense there, I think, from people that at certain points, maybe even the whole thing, that the federal law enforcement was calling the shots on certain things. What's your take on that?
It isn't true, and I'm happy to put that particular rumor to rest. There's plenty to criticize about our handling of WTO. The closest the feds got to having any direct involvement in Seattle's response, the government's response to WTO, was in the 11th hour before the conference began and the demonstrations unfolded and the violence erupted. Paul Schell and the head of the local Secret Service office and I got together in Schell's office. And the Secret Service guy said, you're ready for it. I've never seen such a good job of planning. You know, if this thing goes south, it won't be for a lack of planning. That was very encouraging. That was comforting. And then on the Tuesday that it did in fact go south on us, if I can use that expression, the Secret Service again was involved in a conversation with the mayor, with the governor, with yours truly, Dave Reichert, Annette Sandberg, the Washington State Patrol Chief, and a few others, and certainly my command staff who were involved in the command operations of WTO. And that was, how do we get the president in and out safely? And as far as I know, and I think I know what happened to WTO inside and out, the feds were really unhappy with the fact that there was violence on the streets. The demonstrators they could handle. The violence on the street made them very uneasy because that violence could, in their view, turn toward their boss, POTUS, the president of the United States. So the lead guy from the Secret Service was saying, we've got to get a handle on this. We let him sit in the corner and talk, and we made the decision. The decision was made by the police department, the mayor calling for the state of emergency, and the governor granting it. And clearly, we had our own concerns about the president. We don't want Bill Clinton or any other president coming to Seattle and suffering injury or worse. So we clearly had that same concern as well, but it was only one of many. And that's the full extent of the Fed's involvement. They were not out calling the shots. They weren't making decisions in any of these command posts throughout the city.
Well, unfortunately, we are running short on time. What final thoughts would you like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think I'd probably go back to the top of the program, Mike. I think the attention that we have paid to domestic violence is inadequate. We have got to get much more serious, I think, as a society, as a community, about dealing with violence in the home. I guess I would add to that there is a perception, that lingering perception, that what takes place in the home is private business. And when a crime is committed in the home, it's no longer private. It's public. And neighbors, certainly spouses who have been abused, have got to find a safe way, and we've got lots and lots of ways to counsel and advise them today that we didn't have as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, to call it to our attention so that we can, in fact, deal with it. Secondly, I think in the interest of reducing racism, sexism, homophobia, and every other brand of bigotry that you can imagine, in our community police relations, we need to encourage much, much greater community involvement with our police. It is vital in the interest of effective policing that partnership between community and police gets forged. It's really hard to discriminate against somebody you work with on a regular basis. It's, I should say, much harder. When people get to know one another, when they break down the barriers of race or sex or gender or sexual orientation, you wind up with human beings. And cops are human beings, and citizens are human beings. And when we get to that common denominator, there's no end to what good can be accomplished in making our communities safer and healthier and assuring the rights of all of our citizens.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you.
We have just been talking with Norm Stamper. He is the former Seattle police chief and author of the book Breaking Rank, a top cops expose of the dark side of American policing.